Hi everyone. Welcome to today's session. Today is the third Thursday of the month. As usual, we're trying to have system in place where every third Thursday of the month we have an open community hangout. And today we're going to be talking about ethical branding. And so before we get started, a few house rules. First thing is this is an open forum, so feel free to chat, introduce yourself in the chat, share your LinkedIn profile, and make new connections. If you have any questions anywhere in the process, feel free to raise your hand, preferably your virtual hand, because the person presenting may not be able to see you raise your physical hand. Be kind in your interactions is the second thing. We all come from different backgrounds, different cultures, so be kind as you share your opinion. And we also have different skills, so feel free to share your gifts or experiences or skills that you may have. If you feel that you have a contribution to make, feel free to unmute yourself and contribute. And then, as usual, the law of 2 feet applies. If you feel that maybe the session is not what you expected and you want to leave, feel free to leave. And we hope you can join us in the next session. We also come from different parts of the world, and so English is not the first language for most of us. So don't let that put you off from sharing or contributing. I'm sure we'll find our way around. Feel free to turn on your video as the session goes on. We don't mind messy hair. We don't mind pets, cats or dogs stepping into the screen, or children. That's perfectly fine. And in the process, if you can hear, I have very loud chicken and one specific rooster to my right. So, and a dog that goes off once in a while. So forgive me for that. And then the session is going to be recorded, and we might share it with the community, but we will not share this externally or sell your beautiful faces to anyone. As we get started, so what's brand exchange? For those who are new to the community or new to our events, brand exchange is a call to action for to sell ideas for change or products and services for change better to the rest of the world. We started with the brand thinking canvas, which was developed by Anne, and that's moved into a workshop format. And a few years down the line, it's an education company. We have the book, which is one of the most well-known products of the company. And now we have an amazing community of brand builders and change makers from all over the world. And that is what has enabled us to host events such as today's. We also have some other events happening in the community throughout the year, throughout the month. We have the personal branding mastermind group that's hosted by Hanneke and Bas and David. We also have the Brand Exchange Academy, which is about to get started. We have a brand thinking canvas facilitation course, which is online, and so you can take this on demand at a self-paced and pace yourself as you go. And we also have meetups. So we have the Lisbon meetup, but all things COVID has been online, as well as the global meetup that we are setting up. We also have the monthly community hangouts, such as today's, and the next one is going to be in May, where we will be discussing careers of purpose. So the goal of today's event is to the goal of today's event and the events that we host is to build our knowledge and skills. And I find personally, when we have community hangouts, I always walk away with something new, a different way of thinking from the brilliant minds we have in the community, we also get to come up with ideas for our own brands and meet potential collaborators. So as you chat, as we go into breakout rooms, you will find people who are working on amazing ideas, people who you could partner with or potentially work with in the future. So for today, like I said at the beginning, we're going to be talking about ethical branding, which is an amazing topic that has come up in the community a couple of times. We've had it in questions and a few discussions, but we've not sat together to have an in-depth conversation like we're going to do today. We're going to have 60 minutes for the conversation and then a 30-minute schoolyard for anyone who's able to join us. And at the end of the conversation, I'm going to share a link to a survey, and we hope you can give us your feedback or criticism or any tips and pointers you may have for us. And those really help us mold the nature of our hangouts, improve, and yeah, so we can have better community hangouts in future. I am going to be your timekeeper and host for today, but the conversation is going to be led by Anne Miltenberg, and she's going to introduce herself as she takes over for those of you who do not know her.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne. I think all of you, so I'm not going to waste your time with an introduction, but we have a very nice team of guests that you might not have met yet, and that is Francesca and Anyo. Francesca, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks again, Anne, for inviting me. I was sharing 1 minute before the conversation started that I'm excited and a little bit stressed because I feel there's a lot to learn today for me. Anyway, I'm Francesca. I'm connected from Italy, and I've been a journalist for 20 years. And in these 20 years, 10 years writing and reporting, and 10 years managing magazines and internet websites. And so having a managerial role as editor-in-chief. But then in a sabbatical, I literally changed my life, studying social innovation at Amani Institute in Kenya. And then I started working for projects that had social impact. I really wanted to focus on that kind of work. And currently I am the director of communication of Amani Institute. So this is me, from journalism to communication for social impact projects.
Cool. And Anyo. Anyo is in Manchester.
Yes, hi everybody, and nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me here. I am Anyo, and I am currently the director of Northern Bee Marketing, which is my own marketing agency. I started out in marketing about 12 years ago, and I started marketing as in the corporate world, and I got to the point where I was going home, and this was right around, I would say, the first recession. I was going home and I was feeling just very icky about the strategies we were using and the tactics where we would try to convince people, to spend their last £5 on, like this knickknack for their house that nobody really needs. And so I started doing some soul searching around that and what I wanted my impact to be in terms of how I was influencing people to spend their money. And that's kind of where I stumbled into ethical marketing, and it didn't have a term at the time. It wasn't this known thing like it is now. And so recently I joined the Ethical Move as one of the founding members. And when you are just around people who get it, you just have this release. And that's exactly what it was. It was so nice to be surrounded by people who understood the power of marketing and how good it can be, but who were ready to kind of fight against all of the bad marketing that happens. So I'm happy to join this conversation today. I was sharing with Anne and Francesca and Winju earlier that I've never really thought about marketing from ethical marketing from a branding side until I was asked to join this panel. So I'm really interested to see where the conversation goes, and I hope to learn a lot today.
Cool. Yeah, and it's, it's an interesting thing because I think I was first introduced to the term ethical marketing through Sinead, who runs the Ethical Hour Twitter chat. And that was already like 6 or 7 years ago, I think. And this topic kept coming up around branding. And it's a topic that's really close to my heart, of course, but it's also super complex. And so I thought first of all, I think it's really good to understand, like, okay, well, just because there's a lot of complexity doesn't mean that we need to shy away from talking about it directly. Are you guys seeing my screen? Well, I just support our conversation with a little bit of slides. Cool. So ethical branding. So yeah, personally, I always think like there's two questions in life and in work that are the most difficult to answer. And that's what's the right thing to do and what's the right thing to say. And it feels like that kind of branding piece sits right in the middle of those. So no wonder that it's super complex. And then from my experience in my career in the past 15 years and also already as a student, when you talk about ethics, it feels like, well, there are certain things that are we can kind of, as humanity, all agree on, like certain things that are good, like, let's say helping an orphanage get more donations, and certain things that are bad, like marketing cigarettes to children. But it's often not about those super clear-cut good and bad things. It's like all the gray zones in the middle where kind of those ethical dilemmas really live and where you encounter them in your job. And I think for me, one of the things that that I wanted to get out of this conversation really is a sense of like, do I need a kind of ethical code of conduct? Would that help me? Would that hinder me? But I think just discussing that with all of you, getting to understand what is ethical branding, what are the dilemmas we encounter, how might we resolve them, would be really helpful. Like one of my eye-opening moments in the past 7 years has been that there's so many very clever people in this community that know better than me. So my job is to facilitate the conversation and get out of the way in most cases. So that's what we're going to do. And that is also why I'm so excited to have Francesca and Anyo as part of this conversation. So Francesca has really caught my eye when we first encountered each other, because she has a history of reporting on the mafia. So if there's something, about reporting on good, bad, and evil, she definitely knows all about it. And I was happy to have Anyo on board because of that, the practical experience of creating a code of conduct. So as always, we're going to be using our favorite tool, which is Miro. And I'd like to invite you all to come on board with us on Miro so that we have a little bit more of a canvas to put some thoughts together, because this is a complex topic, of course, and seeing it in front of you might be helpful. So I'm just going to switch you, if you don't have a board yet. Ooh. Yeah, there we go. We're going to switch you to Miro. I'm going to share a link. Are all of you guys on Miro yet? If you've been in one of our previous Hangouts, you probably love it. Okay, so if you go to the chat, you'll find a link. You should be able to join there. And then what happens on my end is I see all of your names pop up on the screen. Oh yeah, I see Sandra, Maria, Francesca. Lovely. Okay, cool. So great. I'm gonna put it on screen so that you can also follow from this perspective, and I can see what's going on. So ethical branding, I thought I would kind of break the ice first by just checking in with you, like what are some of the ethical dilemmas you might encounter on the job? And ethical dilemmas is a bit of a big term, but let's say those are situations where you feel that kind of a weird feeling in your belly where you're not entirely sure if what you're about to do or what you're about to say kind of is the right thing to do or say. So and does anyone have an example? I also there you go, follow me. Yes. I also gathered a couple of examples before this session, but feel free to just, if you want, just turn your microphone off and share a couple of examples. I'll share the one that I got from someone who isn't part of this call, but was part of one of my classes. It was a woman who was working in a communications role for an agricultural charity, and the brand continuously kind of shares these stories about amazing impact, but she felt like those stories were outliers rather than the norm. And so she felt they were told mainly to keep the funding coming, and she didn't know how to deal with that. I'm curious, what other ethical dilemmas you guys experience on the job? To anyone with a recent example? Lungi.
Oh, I raised my hand too soon. It's not a recent example.
Oh, well, that's okay. No worries. Old, new.
Yeah, no, it's pretty old. So this is from a personal experience, my previous job. So for a while, I worked in sales in FMCG sector, but specifically in the alcohol industry. So it was always very interesting to work in the alcohol industry as a sales executive. And you're chasing targets, but at the same time, you have to engage the communities where you are trying to sell in all this volume of beer, to be mindful of things like fetal alcohol syndrome and alcoholism and all the other violent issues that tend to accompany alcohol abuse. But what was always interesting to me at the time is that one of our strongest performing districts was down in the Cape. And that was the area in the country that had the worst problem with things like fetal alcohol syndrome, but somehow they were knocking their volume targets time after time. So it would be a case of sales managers would simply tell you, educate the people, but the decision is up to them. You guys just do the job, make the sales, because that's what we need. And so, yeah, I think that's where my crisis of identity or something similar to what Anyo shared, that's where it kind of started for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that feels like that's a really, really tough one. I see Michelle, you're typing and sharing. Some other people are typing and sharing. That's really great. So donor founder wants to propagate a victim perpetrator narrative.
So like that one is like, for example, like whether it's poverty porn or like victim. So there's this really challenging dynamic that you see with funding going to the most vulnerable people, right? So we go women and girls or people who are marginalized need to raise their voices. And so we're only going to raise their voices without necessarily thinking that that actually increases the violence towards them. But the donor or the funder is so like stuck on this idea because they're not living on the ground to showcasing these voices without looking at the bigger context. Yeah, so, you know, my own journey around that is, do we accept money around this or not? And if not, how do we, you know, do the things we do?
Yeah. I think, yeah, so one of the things that triggers in me is this thought that like as the brand or as the communications, we can kind of hurt or help the cause because how we portray things and how we position it actually has an incredible impact on some of the causes that we're actually trying to change. I think in issues of international development, for instance, this is also so prevalent. This idea of even the wording around like, you know, donor and beneficiary, or using terms like on the ground, on location, feels like you're contributing, but it's really hard to escape that cycle.
I think
If I understand what you're saying.
maybe someone has also mentioned this, where it's like a widely known problem in this world of aid or foundations, where you fund basically someone who is like you in your country, as opposed to funding someone who is local, who knows the context, and like towards proximity. And you can be a recipient of it, for example, like the previous stuff I've done, but should you
Yeah.
take money, as well intentioned as it is, or should you be re-examining the structures that allow you to exist?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I often hear NGOs say we exist to make ourselves obsolete, but there's very few actually would be willing to do that, right?
Is that really true?
Exactly. I see a really interesting note on the right side of my screen, selling promotional products that are sustainably produced, but that are superfluous at the same time. Yeah, that's one of my big pet peeves is the water bottle giveaway. I think I have about 25 water bottles in my kitchen, and every time someone offers me one with their logo on it, I'm like, I don't want any more water bottles. I was part of a workshop with WWF where they gave us plastic water bottles in plastic bags. That was also a really interesting example. Cool. So another really interesting selling and pricing strategies that includes scarcity or anything ending with a 9. That's a really good point. So Anyo, this was a point of the ethical move, a code of conduct that I was like, oh, this is a new one for me. And I realized like, oh, I use scarcity all the time as a tactic. And it's a tough one. I'll really have to examine how I can get, how I can kind of, how do you call it? How I get rid of that tactic from my playbook.
Yeah, I think scarcity is a tough one, right? Because when used in an inappropriate way, for lack of a better term, it can create a sense of anxiety in someone, right? And it's kind of peddling on that fear of missing out, but also just in marketing as a strategy, that we're taught, both in digital marketing and then marketing that doesn't take place digitally. It's a known strategy to tap into people's fears. Like, that is how you're supposed to market. You're supposed to find those things that make them feel a certain way so that they are compelled to make a purchase. And for us at the Ethical Move, we don't think that that's a good enough reason to buy something, because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't have it. And so that's definitely an issue for us. But I think as well, I don't want scarcity to have like a bad rep in and of itself, because there are times in your marketing where you legitimately have a finite number of products or resources. And I think in those instances, it is okay to say to someone, look, there are 10 of these left, and once they're gone, they're gone. But the trend that we're seeing a lot, and this happens quite frequently, like in the coaching arena, is we see people saying, oh, I'm only going to offer this this bundle, at this price, and once the doors are closed, it will never be offered at this price again, when they know in about 3 months' time, it's probably going to be that price again or a little bit lower. So for me, it's about the intention, right? Are you using scarcity because this really is the last of the last that you have of a product or a service, and it will be discontinued? Or are you using scarcity to kind of manipulate people into thinking they have to get it right now?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I thought this was a really really eye-opening point from your manifesto. I just want to jump on, I don't know who placed the comment of who says what is right or wrong. I think that is a really, really good question. That will make me jump to actually the first point, the first frame. So what's our definition of ethical branding? Because when we first started talking about this topic, and I said like, okay, well, what's ethical branding? A lot of the responses that we saw was like, well, doing good through branding. And then I thought, okay, it's great if we have a simple definition, but what's good to me is not what's good to the next person and the next person and the next. And there's so few things that as humans we can agree on these days. So I was curious if any of you have like a working definition or something that you kind of use as a code of conduct for yourself when you think about ethical branding. I guess over the past few years, like my simplest way of putting it was like, do what you say and say what you do. But I think that is a pretty broad definition for just, I guess, living a good life. So I'm very curious also, like, how could we own in on, or is that good enough, or could we hone in on something?
And maybe the reality is to just be very upfront about the trade-offs. Because what's good for one person may not be good for the whole. What's good for the whole may not be good for one person.
Yeah. Could you give me like a practical example how that would play out?
Sure. It's a loaded conversation. Gonna go into it. Anti-racism or systemic racism. So I work with a lot of NGOs or social enterprises. We've had a movement, or at least a verbal movement, towards discussing racism, however you want to talk about it. When rubber hits the road, really looking at the structures of how these systems are set up means owning to the fact that in these systems, there are systemic injustices and we benefit from them. So like if we were to say to the individual, you go fight the power, rise a movement, right? Because it doesn't benefit you in this place. But what benefits, and it's awful to say this in certain, I say traditional or certain systems, that system is beautifully designed to produce the results. So like to kind of talk about this tension between the whole and the individual, like to be very upfront, to go, okay, well, if you really want to do this kind of work, this means A, B, and C. And as an individual, it may not be fair. Like, does that make sense? Or
yeah, no, what I would take away from that is I think if like some of the issues that are really complex, I guess from my point of view, sometimes we use this blanketed language or this language around what we can do for change, and that we can't always, that we like to be let's say including everyone in those messages, but that you actually can't. I think it'd be interesting to think about it, like, let's say from an organizational perspective. So if you're in this, like, let's say the space where you're working, let's say the anti-racism space, what is something that where you feel like, hey, this is where we're really crossing the line between being honest about what we're saying and making false promises to people?
I think when we ask people to do work that as a whole we're not willing to do. So when you, like a concrete example would be on DEI teams, where you get a group of, strappy people who care about these issues, and then you ask them to walk a talk that is not really, it crosses a line because there's really no supporting conditions from the whole to do that work. Or you force everyone to do this work, and then the question is it part of their job? So there's a trade-off. I'm not saying don't do it, do it. I'm just saying I don't think you can say do no harm 100%.
Yeah.
And I think
I think that idea of the trade-off is definitely something I recognize, because there's always everything I feel is always a trade-off in life. Francesca, I saw that you were raising your hand.
I mean, I was going to build on what you were saying before, but in a way it's connected. So you say, in general, the ethical branding definition could be do what you say and say what you do, right? But I think there could be an extra level on it, that it's be open about what are your intention, right? Because you can say things that you're doing with an intention of selling something, with an intention of advocating for something. And it's okay. I am not saying this is bad, right? It's probably not to transform it in a manipulation. It's key probably to share the reason why. And, so it's authenticity, but also transparency on the why. And then there's another key word for me, that is context. I see it in journalism a lot, of course. We used to share news with the perspective of one country, one tone of voice, one audience. And now any piece of news is also out there, right? And of course, there's a matter of different sensitivities, but that's okay. And it's understandable. And I don't think neither a piece of journalism, neither a piece of marketing will always be okay everywhere. That's really impossible. I think if we aim for that, we just stop communicating, because we also need to frame messages in a way that are heard to certain audiences. We can make it every simple, everything plain for everyone. We need to find the language that is also understood. Then we can slowly educate people and move them and spread certain concepts. But if we dream of the message that is perfectly neutral, that it's perfectly ethical all over the world for any audience, we will never find it. We'll just stop talking, right? So again, the intention is about being aware of the context. And when your message skip away from that concept and land somewhere else, that's the moment where you just need to listen and acknowledge and embrace and be ready to say, I'm sorry, I wasn't speaking to that content, or I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I'm sorry, I'm learning. And honestly, this is happening to me on very simple things. When I have to communicate about Amani Institute and we want to launch our programs, that is for fellows everywhere in the world, I may use a picture, I may use a thing. And sometimes we use them, we go out, and then some of the fellows from other countries, hey, Fra, in this picture, you have this person doing this sign with the hands. In our community, that sign means something. Don't do that. Take out that picture. And I run there, I say, sorry, and I remove the picture. Or you used to say, join a tribe of like-minded people. And of course, I believe in this crowd here. Everyone understands what I mean about joining a tribe of like-minded people. But then someone from Brazil told me, hey, Fra, mentioning tribes could look a way of appropriating on other. So it's really about being ready to listen, I would say. And try your best every day.
Well, I think that's a really good point. So it's a learning process. So for instance, when you mentioned about intentions, so I'm always very skeptical of intentions, because a lot of us have good intentions, but very little knowledge of what it takes to do something good in the world. And I think there is a science to that and an art. And that's also a reason why when I first started teaching at Amani Institute, for instance, like the fact that someone had a professional curriculum that was about like, how does social innovation work? I was so impressed by it. And so my biggest concern with this whole purpose trend is that you'll see like everyone at every company will think all of a sudden it's our job to not just do this business, but also to change the world. And in my experience, that's a pretty dangerous attitude. And so I think ethical branding isn't like a destination, but has to be this process of figuring out what is actually the right thing to do. Because as culture progresses, we also, like, our norms of what is the right thing are constantly shifting. What people thought was the right thing to say or do 10 years ago is so different from what it is today, right? I'm just going to look at some of the points here, because I see, like, for instance,
Howard actually has his hand up, I think.
Oh, Howard, sorry.
Thanks, Michelle. Hello, everyone. I think kind of following on from what's all been said now, is I've always struggled with this, the quantitative and the qualitative picture. And what I've experienced here in South Africa many times is, foundations, NGOs, and then their funders love to tell the number story, but the qualitative people impact story is often very far removed from the numbers. So it could be, 200,000, for a simple example, 200,000 meals served every day. That's great, but the quality of the meal is very poor. The experience of the beneficiary is not, is not that one of really being nourished. And I think that is such a tricky one. I remember a couple of years ago in a course on monitoring and evaluation in a business school, one of the lecturers was from an organization that trains in monitoring and evaluation, and kind of at the end of a tough day, he turned around and he said, look, I'm going to be honest with you. In my experience, everybody loves monitoring because that's where we get the numbers, but nobody wants to have evaluation, with the subtext of most of the time there's an awareness that what we're saying is the case is actually not really the case if you start scratching beneath the surface.
I think the whole field of communication, of impact and numbers over quality is such an interesting one, because I think out of like the startup world and this idea of that you constantly have to scale, there's this focus on like you have to make it quantifiable and in numbers. And so like I always struggle with this myself. Like we could technically say like, oh, our learning products, for instance, have reached 10,000 people. But does that mean, yeah, that means like, that could technically mean like 10,000 people have touched the book or 10,000 people have looked at your website. But what does that like, is that honest in your communication? I think technically it is, but I think we can all kind of feel that in fact, it's not actually the case. And one of the thoughts that triggers also in what you're saying is that if as a company you're making claims about impact, you're often treated much more, you'll be held to a higher standard of behavior, right? So there's really interesting academic research into that, and it's called the meat paradox. If you say you're a vegetarian, people will scrutinize your eating behavior and your purchasing behavior far heavier than if you don't make any claims. And I think so if you work in the kind of ethical space or in the impact space, now the weight is on your shoulders to be even more transparent and honest about what you're doing. And in a way, I sometimes feel like, oh, that's unfair. Like, why do these organizations get such a heavy burden? And I'm not just doing good, but then also like, communicating so well. And that's a tough one. Anyo, I see you're raising your hand.
I think this is a brilliant question and a point from you, Howard. And it's something that I think, as a marketer, this is something that we are trained to pick up on. Like, we're constantly getting caught up in clients and everybody wants to know, what's my reach? What are my analytics? What do the analytics say? But if you take it a step back, even in, like I do Instagram marketing and social media marketing as my specialty. And when you run ads on those platforms, if you look at the language that even, Facebook and Instagram use and how they talk about your ads, they're very selective. They say things like they served your ad to such and such a number of, accounts. And it's those little veiled references, right? They're not telling you how many people actually saw the ad that you've paid for. They're not even disclosing the fact that ads may be shown to people to accounts that haven't logged in for the last 6 years. Things like that. All they have to do to fulfill their requirement is to serve your ad to a certain number of people. So I think this whole qualitative versus quantitative discussion is something that we've kind of inherited, within this marketing and branding arena. There's not been a lot of people coming up against it. And I think as a result of it, we've all kind of gotten roped into these tactics that yeah, someone said vanity measures. Exactly. They're vanity metrics, right? And we've all kind of gotten roped into these vanity metrics, and we don't really have a clear route out of them, and we don't know how to divorce ourselves from them.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the quantity and the quality, so on the quality side, for instance, when we really look for anecdotal evidence and real evidence from people, then on the storytelling side, I also have some some challenges sometimes where I feel like, okay, well, the stories maybe aren't representative of the whole, or the fact that certain people, for instance, I've often, this has annoyed me about the whole focus on personal branding and for instance, bringing personal trauma into your story, that this can be very harmful, as well. I saw a young woman who was trained to promote this initiative for victims of rape, and was basically told that her personal story of rape was the most powerful way to kind of present that. And I felt very uncomfortable with someone telling someone to relive that experience every time they have to go through the process of promoting their movement. Yeah, it seems left or right, there's a lot of trade-offs to make, as Michelle was saying too. So what could, I'm very curious, what could an ethical code of conduct for brand building look like? And so I thought about like 3 different pillars. So there's definitely that whole area of like, how do we talk about impact, or how do we talk about intentions, or how do we actually do what we say? And I wasn't sure if everyone knew about, for instance, the ethical moves, these ethical marketing guidelines. So I just kind of summarized them. I hope I've done so accurately, Anyo. The ethical move has a series of points of code of conduct. Avoiding charm prices, not to use countdown timers, false scarcity, transparency, not to use bait and switch. It's such a huge one that I love. How would something like that play out on the brand building front? Very curious if anyone has any ideas. I guess what we could all do is maybe make a statement in the form of a pledge that all of us would be willing to take. So for instance, I could say, I pledge not to leverage the cliche of the disparity between the West and the global South in a brand. This is something that I encounter quite a bit in my work, because so many of the kind of organizations in the impact space kind of still move from let's say Europe or North America to places in the global South. They have to leverage kind of this cliche image that people in the North and in the West still have about the global South. And I think it would be good for me to just pledge not to play into that and to find a alternative, like, because that's the next step, right? So you can create this code of conduct of like, these are the things that I'm not going to do, but then, okay, well, but what does that mean about what you will actually do? Cool. So let's see. I recognize and always consider that there are cultural differences that must be respected to fight against stereotypes. Yeah.
That's such a good one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, and I'm just playing devil's advocate, and maybe Francesca, because I think you raised on the muddy water that, you know, isn't there a risk that if you make a pledge and you put it out there, and you fall foul, and I guess in the Amani context, your audience is a bit more forgiving because there's an understanding that the intention was good, but perhaps the execution was where things went wrong, and where, context, it didn't cover for context. But, as a brand in this world of social media where people are so unforgiving, is it not also, just possibly opening yourself up to get crucified online, even where you are willing to say, I put my hand up, I fell foul, and I apologize, and this is what I want to do about it. But you just kind of open the door for all that negative backlash, which may or may not be justified, and end up tarnishing who you are and what you do in a way that you can never recover from.
Well, I totally hear you, and honestly, for example, I'm a person that when I hear this crazy backlash against someone or an organization, I usually don't jump on it, even if I see the mistake they did, right? Because this polarization that we are seeing in politics is happening also in the way of building a common understanding. But in this case, I would talk to those who are criticizing and saying, you are complaining because your voice wasn't heard, because you are not included in the conversation, but when you attack so heavily, you just criticize, and that you are not building a conversation, right? So I think words both ways can be weapons or can be bridges. And so, of course, if a brand is very bold, there's always been like on a higher level, just communicating one way and then do something stupid also receives one-way communication. But if the door was open, and even a brand in some way can show vulnerability or the willingness to build bridges with these audiences, then probably things go a little bit better. But I think it's on all of us to be able to have this kind of conversation in a more constructive way. I think this is really key. Even when something goes madly wrong, there's no reason to attack, there's more reason to teach. And then on the other side, you have to have someone who listens, of course. But I think that's how we should make it happen. Otherwise, we are also polarizing that conversation, and I don't think it's gonna bring us anywhere.
Nyambura, I saw that you raised your hand.
Hi, yes, I do have a question. And this has to do especially with the statement I see on the screen. I pledge to recognize and always consider that there are cultural differences that must be respected. And in today's I like the word polarized society, you find that there are, everyone is using certain, buzzwords or certain words to show how inclusive they are and how accommodating they are. And sometimes you find that it's not every community or every culture or society that appreciates the kind of inclusion that is kind of gaining prominence in the world. And I feel like, where is the balance where you're speaking to a community that does not, I'm not saying everyone in that community, but a big part of it is conservative or doesn't quite buy into a lot of, I don't want to call them trends because it's kind of waters down what's happening, but it kind of is a trend, hot button topics, let me call them that. And so how does an organization place itself in such a way that they stay true to themselves and at the same time don't pass a message that is offensive to the people they're trying to reach?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to bring up, because I feel like a lot of conversations within the social innovation and social enterprise space are generally between people who are, let's say, politically progressive. And so there is a pretty big, I think there's a pretty big bias around what we think is good, even though we might all have very different cultural backgrounds. And one of my eye openers was, for instance, last year I was stuck in Texas for 3.5 months due to COVID. And it's like, wow, this is just insane. Like, you're in Republican country. And then you get to know people and you're like, oh, there's no reason to be afraid to go outside. These people are quite nice. And people have a lot of guns, but they're also, you know, they bake cookies. And but without, like, all kidding aside, for instance, like Patagonia has an interesting book for tools for grassroots environmentalists. And in it, they, for instance, share research about how you can talk to conservative people about climate change. And so they look at what are the values, for instance, of people who are conservative, for instance, if they're more prone to being a nationalist or religious. Can you talk about, for instance, you know, maintaining natural spaces for your grandchildren, or you know, being shepherds of the earth? And so I think that's a huge, was a big eye opener for me as well. Like, oh yeah, okay, we need to understand how to also bridge the divide and understand the biases that we come with. And I think, Francesca, probably you have a super difficult job because you, like, your organization spans so many different countries that you're like, it's almost impossible not to offend any of your different audiences on any given day. Anyo, you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to that, because this is something that we come up against at the Ethical Move. And one of the things that I would say that I try to do is, we've touched on this already, is to always be learning, right? And to be willing to hold your hand up and say, you know, I was wrong, I've done the wrong thing. So I think having that, coming at these situations from that point of view will help to soften the blow. And also, I feel like, I don't know if this is something that everyone agrees with, but from a marketing point of view, since COVID, I feel like the way consumers have approached marketing has really softened. And this almost instant demand, you know, for issues to be sorted straight away and for things to happen, you know, by tomorrow, seems to have really softened, as well as we've all adjusted to know new ways of working and new ways of living. And I've started to see that in how consumers communicate with brands online, like this, the tone of messages, and there's a lot less picking on brands, I would say, and pointing things out. Like, people seem to be a lot more respectful in how they communicate in at least in marketing, on things like, you know, Facebook pages. They seem to be just a lot less volatile than they were, say, pre 2019. So I think there's been this shift as people have, you know, kind of sat with not having much to do over the last year, and and their whole life changing. The way we consume content and the way we respond to content largely seems to have changed. So I think there is space, you know, for a brand to say, look, we got it wrong. You know, we're in this process where we're continuing to learn. But I also think there's an opportunity as well to be as diverse as possible within your own organization. And when you build your organization up with diversity in mind, hopefully, you know, your diverse team is able to pick up on some of these things before they become an issue and before they are customer facing. And that's a really nice way to kind of nip things in the bud before they become an issue, is, you know, pass it, like, run everything through the lens of diversity on your team. And if, you know, if it's a problem, then it doesn't ever get to the stage where your consumers are made aware of it.
That's a huge point. So I think in terms of walking the talk, I think having people on the team who represent the audiences that you serve is really critical there, because then you don't probably get into these situations as quickly as you would otherwise, because you would have a lot of internal voices that would question that before it would ever get into the outside world.
Yeah.
I was also, what I've found, and I'm curious what you think about this, Anyo. So I've learned in the past 15 years that we often make a lot of assumptions about the audiences that, whatever brand you're building, that the audience that you serve, and that it's almost impossible to truly understand what people's needs are, and what kind of positioning, what kind of language, what kind of visual elements that you can use both to represent yourself, but also to attract those other people. And that we really need to put in the time to get to know them better and to slash this kind of divide that you have with your audiences. And that we often actually don't invest that time into doing that research and speaking to people, which also leads to I think, these kind of horrendous situations where statements are released or brands are sent into the world that sometimes are so incredibly contrary to what they seem to want to achieve.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely an issue, right? I think it stems from, creating a brand without knowing what problem you're trying to solve. Because if you are problem and solution focused, then it doesn't really matter what you perceive your audience's needs to be, because you know what their problem is and you are providing them that solution. And I think that is probably the clearest way. Like, that's whenever I'm working with a client, that's what I want to know. I want to know, what is your audience's problem and how have you solved it? Because that's the key, right? It doesn't really matter, what their favorite food is or how they like to spend their time or what platforms they use. What's key is what their problem is and how you solve it. And once you've cracked that, and once you market and brand yourself from that point of view, anything else you do, it's almost irrelevant, really, because people are selfish and they're self-centered, right? When they're looking at a brand, a lot of times they want to know, what's in it for me? How are you going to, make my life better, make my business better? And so if we're always marketing from that point of view, then we're always on target in terms of what we're delivering.
Cool. I'm making that a note. More on point. Awesome. Let me.
At the same time, I think to really understand the problem, you also need to understand who is your audience, right? It's both ways.
Yes.
So I'm totally with you. But I think there's something around branding. There was a moment that branding means telling stories. There was this storytelling buzzword happening, right? As if with storytelling you can manipulate everything. So it's all about telling stories. Now I think there's another thing coming or already happening, that is branding is community building. Storytelling, that could be a wonderful way of doing branding. I think community building can also be a wonderful way to understand your audience. And of course, if you go to the extreme of making it in a inauthentic way, then it becomes again negative as storytelling, as manipulation. So I think again, there's no white and black. There's a lot of gray areas. But I think maybe having this in mind as a directions that you can consider to have a better understanding of your audience, of communicating better with your audience. But again, aware of not going to the extreme, that could be a different thing.
Yeah, the whole shift to community building, I think that's worth another hangout, which I'd love to get into. There's so much to be said about brands and community, and it really takes a different style of leadership, I think, to be able to do that. I'm sorry, guys, I'm not seeing who's raising their hand at the moment because I'm sharing the screen. So if you do have your hand up, sorry, just turn on your mic and jump in. I wanted to see if there's some notes that I haven't touched upon. Okay, so as a consultant in the branding industry, I pledge to bring the ethical conversation with to designers and consultants as well. Who shared this note?
That was me.
Tell me, Maria.
Yeah, I think there's a meta conversation in all this discussion, right? Because we are talking about how we deal with clients, but I think there's also another conversation that, or I think there's some space to have this kind of conversation within the designers, within brand developers, agencies, and how we do our work. Because if we are always following the clients, it's like we will be in same place, right? So sometimes it's not only about how we deal with the clients and what we do with our work and where we take them, but I see that there's also some ethical issues within designers as well, and when we are, it's so easy right now to comment on others' projects and how they did it and what's the solution they brought to an organization or whatever they're doing, and I think the same things we are saying for our clients to zoom out and to have a better perspective and understand every point of view. I think we need to do that as well within the industry.
Well, in that sense, I also think that it's very cyclical, right? These conversations. So when I was in design school back in the early 2000s, it was like the high point of the Naomi Klein no logo movement. And branding was like the world's most evil topic in the world. And it was just like that. This was like the Nike and McDonald's are evil kind, and you had T-shirts made about it and that type of era. And there was the First Things First manifesto. I'm not sure if any of you guys know it, but this was, I think, from the a manifesto from the 1970s that said if you're in advertising, you should never work for the tobacco industry and you should only work for good. And then that came back in the early 2000s and was signed again in an updated version by creatives across the world. And so the fact that we're seeing this again now, I think, is within the industry is definitely good. But one of the things I also don't want to shy away from is that if we are brand builders, but we are not the brand itself, it's really sometimes complicated, right? To influence the full extent to which the brand that you're building with a client is actually walking the talk. And I think that's also where a lot of the ethical dilemmas often come from for the people, also in this group that are the creatives or the strategists. Like, oh, okay, well, I have this idea of how I think, what I think is good and bad, and the client isn't always in agreement with that, or they aren't always willing to walk the talk. So I noticed that some of I think Maria, one of these ethical dilemmas here on the next board was yours, just or an example that you shared. So some of the ethical dilemmas, for instance, were, let me see where I put it. So for instance, if you're in an agency, if you don't want to work for a particular client, but you're not the one deciding, that can be really tough. I wonder, so Maria, you kind of resolved that issue by starting your own business, and Anyo, I think that's what you were saying too. But I was also curious, maybe there's someone on this call who has actually managed to resolve some of this on the job. Marika, curious what your experience is. Is Marika still here? Maybe she's not. Cool.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I'm still here. Yeah, but I worked for an agency where that was respected. So when you had a client that you didn't want to work for, you just could refuse the job. And in general, the owners were rather ethical in their choice of clients. So I didn't have that many dilemmas at the job, to be honest, because I did say no to some jobs, but that was never a problem. People understood that.
So I would take away from that, you can't necessarily choose which clients you get when you work in an agency, but you can choose if you work for ethical bosses or not.
That is definitely a choice. Yes.
So, although you don't always know that in advance.
Yeah. No, well, you do, in a way you do. I mean, I think you can research what clients a company is working for, and then you can decide whether you want to work for them. And but yeah, I find this a very, very gray area, because I've worked for very large corporations, and I'm sure not everything they did was good. So I find this a gray area. And it's neither black nor white. It's very gray. It's not very binary.
Yeah.
And
Well, that's also, sorry, go ahead.
no, go on, please.
Well, one of the things that I'm always afraid of is that you can also very quickly kind of drown in the situation where there's this holier than thou. I have my ideals and I know what is right and wrong, so I'm gonna like draw this line. And I've always found that to be those people really difficult to work with, because I felt like, while it's, for instance, you can be a hardliner as a designer in an agency about which client you take on, but then if you look at your private life, you might not be so hardline when it comes to decisions that you're making in your own life about where you're trading off, for instance, comfort and animal cruelty, or comfort or price and human rights in for wages in low income countries. So that's a really tough one. So I'm just gonna make sure that I capture that note and like choose ethical bosses.
Well, for instance, you can tell if the company you work for works for an oil company, and if you don't want to work for an oil company, then you shouldn't apply there. Or if they work for cigarette companies. But I know I worked for banks, and I'm not sure where all these banks invest in. So it's only so far that you can take it, I think, if you work for a company.
And also, I think you can utilize the interview process, right? When you have that part in the interview where they say, "Do you have any questions for us?" Use that to ask those hard-hitting questions, like, "What's your ethical policy? What do you do to be more diverse and inclusive?" And put them on the spot in the very early stages.
Sure, but I think here you're touching onto something very different, because I think diversity is still a big issue in at least in design in the Netherlands. It's very, very hard to make the design industry more diverse. I don't know why. It's just hard.
We'll dedicate a hangout to that as well. Francesca raised her hand, and I wanted to check in with what you, and then Maria was raising her hand as well, so I'll give the word.
Maybe Maria raised her hand first, I have to say.
Maria.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to speak up about this because I really feel I need to do this. I have the feeling that we're talking about organizations and brands. I already wrote it in the chat, but I feel that we are forgetting that there are people behind these organizations, and it's not that simple to say, okay, this organization works for this client, so I can choose not to work for this organization. And it's not that simple, because inside one organization there are many different people, and as larger the organization is, the most difficult is. Maybe that's my experience. And it's not that easy to make that decision, because there are many things, different things going on in the same place. So I think it's about how we lead the organizations. It's about understanding that there are people, human beings behind every organization and every brand as well, every client as well. Just my 2 cents.
If I can just jump on that comment myself. So I put a note here. So one of the things, I'll just go to the how we might resolve them board. But this is not always in our reach if we're brand developers from the outside. But I think as kind of a brand building community, this idea that you integrate the purpose in all the different pillars of the brand. So it's not just about brand and communications and marketing, but it's about HR policies, and it's about the technology that you use and the privacy. It is about the products and services that you develop and the sourcing of that. It is about the different places and events that you choose to attend or that you develop. So the examples where I've been involved with, for instance, defining a new purpose for a bigger company, one of the challenges there, and I think this is really just good to recognize, is that there are a lot of people inside bigger organizations who really want to have a positive impact. But for instance, their mandate just doesn't stretch across all these different pillars. So for instance, I also worked with a bank, and I use this example a lot. And their initial purpose 100 years ago was to support smallholder farmers, and they got away from that very far. They wanted to return to it, so they were working on this big campaign. And then when we started to talk about, when we were using the brand thinking canvas and we started to talk about HR and policy, I asked, like, okay, well, what is, for instance, how are your salespeople rewarded? And he said, well, it's just volume of loans. And I said, okay, but you can't actually realize this idea of purpose of supporting smallholder farmers if none of your salespeople are going to be rewarded for doing that. And then he got a little bit dizzy from that conversation because, as the brand manager, he can't necessarily, he doesn't have the mandate to tell the person in HR to change their entire bonus system. It would drive away their best salespeople, et cetera. So I think it's also, it would be short-sighted to think that, everyone in bigger companies just doesn't want to change. Like these are complex things that are going to take time. Howard, I was, you're mentioning you're using a word in your note that I've been using a lot recently, and it's about serving. Could you explain to me why you use that word? Because I'm fond of it, but I'm curious. You're a language guy, so.
I think we're all language people, anyway. No, I mean, I guess just that thing of serve. I mean, I was more, the line of thinking was, I've seen it once or twice where people have actually articulated the ideal client, and I'm wondering if that's not maybe a step in a way. I mean, there's obviously a risk associated in how you perceive, but kind of again standing true to your colors. Because I mean, I'm always interested on how you go to these amazing people's websites and then you look at who their customers are. And for me, it's kind of a list of people that I wouldn't really want to work for because of my perception of who they are and how they operate in the world. But obviously the pull of the name, to say I've worked for Nike or McDonald's is a great one from a perception of thing, but I've seen once or twice where people have actually been brave enough to say our ideal client is, or, things we care about, almost as a way of saying to the people who fall outside of that, we don't really want to serve you. We're not going to say it, but we kind of want to, again, almost like a pledge, say, these are the kind of people we like to serve. I'm not sure how effective it is in practice, but I think it's that, again, it's that, trying to move towards a place of not just saying a pledge to, but these are the examples of things I care about and where we've put work. It might even be kind of pro bono consulting work, but sort of trying to get, maybe articulate to your ideal customer or the people, your ideal audience, this is where we want to put our energy. And if you feel like you're aligned with that, then let's have that conversation.
Mm.
I have no evidence if that works in practice or not, but I think it's also quite a brave step to kind of almost draw a line in the sand and say, if you're on that side, you know, don't bother calling us because it's a no deal.
Yeah, well, I would also challenge like, so I think that is definitely one way that could be really helpful. On the other hand, I also think having the conversations, drawing the line and always saying like, well, these are the bad guys and we won't work with them. Like, that's great. Now we're all going to keep our hands very clean. But there's also, I think, something to be said for like minimal amounts of change within some of these really big companies will have a massive effect. So for instance, like, you know, McDonald's making one little change in their production will have much more impact than all the little vegan restaurants in the world can make. And recognizing that there's a lot of people in that organization that also are humans that want to do good, and seeing how we can get them to follow along, not by necessarily labeling them as, you know, as the people we don't want to work with, but actually saying like, okay, how could we get them on board? But I think it's very good to know for yourself, like, who are you willing to work with and who not.
If I can add something on that, it was something I wanted to share also from a personal experience, like when we were talking about the dilemma, working with who and why. Sometimes we need to be where they don't think like us, because we need to bring the conversation there, no? As Anne was saying, and if McDonald's makes a small change, it has a huge impact. So who goes there and speak to McDonald's, right? You need to be there. And so even when it's about working for an organization, I was working for Sky as a journalist many years ago, Sky in Italy, and then a few years later, after I had my experience in social innovation in Kenya, Sky called me again and said, do you want to become our director of corporate communication? And I was like, no way, I don't want to do that. Not Sky, not the Sky with Murdoch and all the issues that were there at that time. And then they insisted. I'm like, no, you know, I'm in Kenya, I'm working in social impact, I don't want to come back there, thank you. And the person that was going to hire me or was pushing me to be there said, you know, Fra, I know you're working with impact, but you're working with a small organization in Kenya now. What if you are taking this impact on the level that Sky could have in Italy? And so we started having this conversation about impact, and my role moved from head of corporate communication to head of cultural impact. So they created a job role for me. So I had to say yes at the end. I went and I stayed 1 year. And in that 1 year, I knew for 99% of my time, I would have done things that not were totally against my values, but that I didn't like, promoting a TV program or a star or whatever, or talking about football. It's really not me, right? But for the 1% of my time, at least, I could have done something meaningful. And I did. But at a certain point, there was again this question, is this enough to me? And so I think it really, this dilemma can have an answer, but this answer can also change across time. So it's about you. How much do you feel you can put into changing the system or operating in the systems? And in our career, we may have moments where we are more ready to change the system and we find allies and we see the change happening. And so we impact the entire ecosystem. In other moments, we are too alone and maybe it's not the right moment for us, or we don't speak the right language to be heard by the CEO. Maybe. So I think it's also about keeping on asking ourselves the question, am I having the impact that I'm able to have? If it's the right context, it's the right moment. It's like in love, you need to meet the right person in the right moment. And I think impact is a little bit the same. So this is where I answer to the dilemma. It's not, this is okay, this is not. It's how this match what I'm able to do right now with the role I am playing in the system. So
yeah, I think that's a yeah, and I think that reflection is so interesting coming from you, like having tried inside that organization. I was just listening to a talk yesterday You know, sometimes people just surprise you. I don't know, I'll just share my screen really quickly. So I was listening to a talk where I don't know if anyone in this group knows WWE. This is an American company, entertainment company in wrestling. And I was listening to a story, to an interview with the brand manager. They have a partnership with UNICEF. And I was like, what the, like, how does this
Wow.
work? And here is this lovely, like, Southern American woman with like big fake eyelashes and huge loops. And she was talking about like, well, they're an entertainment company. They're for families. There's 900 million people in the world who watch their shows. And it's a family affair. The whole family gets together to watch these like performance wrestling matches. And she said like, well, okay, so it's really like one big part of our values here is like family values. And I was like, this doesn't make sense to me as someone who
Really?
never sees this. And she was like, so when I met the people at UNICEF and they were talking about how they wanted to create this online program to get more kids moving, I was like, that's a perfect program for us to support. So they took a couple of their superstar wrestlers and put them in these UNICEF shows to get kids moving. And it's a huge success. Like they leveraged the 900 million people that watch these shows to help UNICEF reach more people. Of course, it makes WWE look good, but really, like, I haven't found any place on any of their stuff where they're promoting this. And so I, again, like to the point of like, people can surprise you and you never know from the outside. I thought that was a really, really interesting example of like, wow, if you're willing to kind of look beyond the fence and see, you know, with whom you could create these, you know, pretty impactful alliances. I think there's some amazing opportunities. Guillermo, you have your hand raised.
Hi, yes, I was caught by what Francesca said, since I'm working for the packaging industry for more than 20 years. So, and I am fighting for the quest of zero packaging. So it's quite contradictory that I am working for an industry which I want to convert or to transform into another thing. And I think that packaging will not will be always a need, because we cannot take into our hands the products that we buy. So we need. Once I was at a conference and a master of graphic design and branding identity was giving a speech, and suddenly it came up the subject of ethics in graphic design. If you have to work for a politician campaign that you are not fond of, if you have to do that or not. He said, someone who works for a guns factory is a killer, or it's just doing his job. So if your stomach can stand what you are doing, do it. If you have to do it to earn your, if you do that for your living, and if you don't agree, go away. Just walk away and do another thing. So sometimes we are forced to work for things that we are not 100% happy with, but I think that we also have the opportunity, being inside that, to promote changes. And working on that industry, on that kind of job that you don't like, doesn't make you a monster if you are aware of what you're doing and what you want to achieve. Maybe you are a small seed that could plant some seeds in other people's mind. And it's also a way to find what's your mission inside that industry. So if you don't work for a change and you leave, that industry won't change, maybe, or will take more time, or at least you have your conscious happy that you are doing your best to do what you're doing. So I think it is better not to leave, but trying to do something and trying to transform what you're not happy with, and not run, just do something.
Yeah,
so that's my dilemma.
Yeah, that's also thanks Namura for being with us. You gotta go. See you soon. That was what Maria was also saying about planting the seed, and I really love this comment that Francesca is making about you know, whether you choose not to change the industry that you're in or not. And I think like, for instance, I once was fighting in the creative industries to have more discussion around entrepreneurship, and then I stepped out of the fight, and because it was really, I felt like Don Quixote who was fighting the windmills. And then I found my way around it. And in the past 10 years, the cultural shift has actually solved the whole dilemma for me. And I think in terms of packaging, for instance, like the immense consumer pressure on more sustainable packaging, of course, helps. And having insiders just fueling that fire, I think, is really important. So thanks, Guillermo, for being on that team.
Thank you.
Cool. So we have some ideas of how to resolve some of our dilemmas. Hey, Raquel, thanks for joining. See you soon. See you soon. I know I was thinking maybe with what we have on Miro, we'll do a little brainstorm, and then if I can run it past you at any point, if we have some sort of something close to what the ethical move has. I'm curious what your opinion.
Oh yeah, please do. I would love to see it.
Cool. Thanks, Francesca, and thanks, Anyo, for joining us and for sharing your perspectives. I really, really appreciate you making the time for this. I'm sure you get like 1,000 people go like, we want to talk to you about this. Yeah, and let's get. I think this is worth like 10 other conversations. So I'd love to keep talking about this. We'll share the recording on the community network, and any thoughts you might have that pop into your head overnight or on the weekend as you're taking a walk, hopefully outside, hopefully if you're not on lockdown, I'd love to hear it. So really cool. And yeah, I guess we spent our schoolyard time just continuing the conversation, but if you're still up for a drink or something right now, I'm going to be hanging out a bit with Wanjiru.
I want to just thank everyone, because as I imagine, it was super insightful and I had a lot to learn. And also I share my email. I'm of course in the community, in the Brand Change community, but I must confess, I'm not always in. So if you need to reach me for something, reach me by email. But then I also sometimes come and read the community, but I'm on many platforms at the same time. So if you really need me, I put my email in the chat. But thank you, thank you. It was super, super interesting to be here. Thanks, Anne.
You're welcome. It's a river that you can come back to every now and then to dip your foot in, no problem.
I do.
Oh, yes.
I always come behind the scene. I don't participate much because I'm afraid that maybe I'm not there to reply, and I don't want to be the one that can't say something and run away. But I always come and read a lot.
Yeah, it's really lovely to have people like you. For those of us like Maria, so Maria is a certified trainer with us, and actually ended up joining Amani Institute, the social innovation program. So if you're interested in like the art and science of like how do you make a difference in the world and how do you create a career of purpose, like Amani Institute is just amazing experience. I mean, I'll let Maria do the actual experience from the participant side. I've only been teaching, but they've really impressed me. And so Francesca's colleague, Roshan Paul, will be taking that seat in 2 months. So we'll talk with him in May about building careers of purpose, and that'll be more of a fireside chat, but we're also welcoming questions there. So if any of you guys have questions about, like, you know, how do I actually create a career that's aligned with my values, then Roshan is kind of the go-to guy to answer those questions.